I knew the HOA would eventually come for me. They always did. But I wasn't expecting to find a printed violation notice taped to my garage door like some cheap ransom note. Garage door does not comply with HOA aesthetic guidelines. Immediate corrective action required. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines. I stared at the paper, narrowing my eyes at the signature at the bottom. Nancy Whitmore, HOA president. Of course, it was her. Nancy was a middle-aged tyrant with nothing better to do than make life miserable for homeowners who didn't bow to her every ridiculous demand. The kicker? I was the architect who designed every home in this neighborhood, including hers. I ripped the notice off my garage and stormed inside, tossing the paper onto the kitchen counter. My husband, Warren, glanced up from his laptop, raising an eyebrow. HOA nonsense again? Oh, you have no idea. Apparently, my own garage doesn't comply with their aesthetic guidelines. He let out a low chuckle. You mean the guidelines based on your designs? Exactly. I threw my hands up. I created the blueprint for this entire development. And now Nancy wants to tell me my garage is wrong. Warren leaned back in his chair. You gonna play nice? Or are you gonna have fun with this? I grinned. Oh, I'm gonna have fun. Nancy had no idea who she was messing with. I spent the evening digging through my files. I still had the original architectural plans from when I designed the neighborhood. I pulled up the HOA's official guidelines, ones that were, funnily enough, based entirely on my original designs. If my garage was in violation, then half the neighborhood was, too, including Nancy's own house. The next morning, I marched over to the HOA office, a small, stuffy building at the entrance of the neighborhood. Nancy was inside, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her desk as she typed. She looked up, her thin lips curling into a fake smile. Elaine, she said, voice dripping with condescension. I assume you're here about your violation notice? That's right. I slapped my documents onto her desk. I'd love for you to explain to me exactly how my garage violates aesthetic guidelines. Nancy barely glanced at the paperwork. It's simple. Your garage door is a non-approved style. It disrupts the uniformity of the neighborhood. I crossed my arms. Nancy, my garage is the exact design outlined in the original plans. The same plans that were used to approve every home here, including yours. Her expression faltered for a moment before she sniffed. Well, we've updated the guidelines since then. Oh? When? I flipped through the HOA's document. Because according to your own rules, any changes must be approved by a community vote. And I don't recall any vote on garage doors. Nancy's face turned pink. The board has the authority to make adjustments as needed. I gave her a knowing look. The board can propose adjustments. But without a vote, they're unenforceable. Nancy's fingers twitched. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not with facts. Regardless, your garage doesn't match the rest of the neighborhood. I leaned forward. Nancy, I designed this neighborhood. If my garage doesn't match, then neither does yours. Her mouth opened, then closed. She knew I had her. But I wasn't done yet. I pulled out another set of papers and placed them in front of her. Since you're so concerned with aesthetics, I took the liberty of reviewing the other violations in the neighborhood. Did you know that nearly a third of the homes, including yours, have unapproved modifications? Nancy's eyes darted to the papers. That's illegal, I finished for her. Selective enforcement is against HOA regulations. If you fine me, you have to fine everyone. Her jaw clenched. I could practically see the gears turning in her head, trying to find a way out. Finally, she forced a tight smile. I'll have to review this with the board. You do that, I said, turning on my heel. Oh, and Nancy? Next time you try to pull something like this, at least make sure you're not breaking your own rules. As I walked out, I could feel her glare burning into my back. This wasn't over. But neither was I. After leaving the HOA office, I returned home with a sense of satisfaction. But I knew Nancy wouldn't back down so easily. People like her never admitted defeat. They schemed, manipulated, and came back with a new way to enforce their petty control. I needed to be ready. I spent the next few days gathering more evidence. I reviewed every HOA document I could get my hands on, cross-referencing them with city zoning laws and state regulations. I wanted to be prepared for whatever Nancy tried next. Warren watched me from the kitchen as I flipped through pages, highlighting key sections. "You're really going all in on this, huh?" he said, taking a sip of coffee. "Of course," I replied. "Nancy's not just coming after me. If she gets away with this, she'll start targeting other homeowners for whatever nonsense rules she makes up next." "Fair point," he said. "So, what's your next move?" I tapped a section of the HOA bylaws. "A community meeting is scheduled for next week. If Nancy tries to enforce these violations, she'll have to bring it up there. I plan to make sure the entire neighborhood knows exactly what she's up to." As expected, trouble arrived sooner than I anticipated. 2 days later, I stepped outside to find a fresh notice taped to my front door. This time, the language was more aggressive. Final warning. Failure to comply with HOA aesthetic standards will result in escalating fines and potential legal action. I sighed, shaking my head. Nancy was doubling down. She thought she could intimidate me into compliance. She thought wrong. Instead of removing the notice, I left it up for my neighbors to see. And sure enough, by the afternoon, people had started noticing. Mrs. Patel, who lived across the street, walked over with a concerned expression. "Elaine, what's going on? I saw the notice on your door." "The HOA is claiming my garage doesn't meet their aesthetic standards," I explained, "even though it was built exactly according to the original plans." Her eyes widened. "But that doesn't make sense. Your house is one of the best-looking ones here." "Exactly," I said. "Nancy is just on a power trip. And if she can do this to me, she can do it to anyone." By the evening, word had spread. Several neighbors stopped by, frustrated by the HOA's overreach. Many of them had their own grievances: unjust fines, arbitrary rule changes, and selective enforcement. I saw an opportunity. The next day, I drafted a petition demanding transparency in HOA rule enforcement, requiring any new regulations to be voted on by the community before implementation. I printed copies and went door to door, explaining the situation. My neighbors were more than willing to sign. By the end of the day, I had over 30 signatures, more than enough to make an impact at the upcoming meeting. The night of the meeting arrived and the HOA clubhouse was packed. Homeowners filled every chair, some even standing along the walls. Nancy sat at the front, flanked by the other board members. She wore a smug expression, clearly expecting to control the discussion. That changed the moment I stood up. I walked to the front of the room, holding up the petition. "Before we begin, I'd like to submit this for the record." A petition signed by over 30 homeowners demanding that all HOA rules be subject to a community vote before enforcement. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Nancy's smile faltered. She cleared her throat. "While we appreciate community input, the board has the authority to enforce existing regulations." I nodded. "Then let's talk about those regulations. Specifically, the so-called violations you issued against my garage." I placed the original architectural plans on the table. My home was built exactly to the specifications outlined in these plans, the same plans that were used to approve every house in this neighborhood. Nancy's expression hardened. "The board has updated the guidelines to maintain property values." I raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. Because according to the HOA bylaws, any changes require a community vote. When exactly did that vote happen?" Silence. Someone in the crowd spoke up. "Yeah, I don't remember voting on that." Another voice joined in. "Neither do I." Nancy's hands clenched. "The board has discretion." I cut her off. "Only within the limits of the bylaws. And selective enforcement is illegal. If my garage is in violation, then so is yours, along with half the houses in this neighborhood." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Nancy's face turned red. I continued, "That means either you rescind my violation or you fine yourself and dozens of other homeowners. Which is it?" Nancy opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was trapped. One of the other board members, an older man named Richard, cleared his throat. "I think we should table this discussion and review the enforcement policies." Nancy shot him a glare, but he avoided her gaze. I smiled. "That sounds like a great idea. Transparency benefits everyone, after all." Applause erupted from the audience. Nancy sat stiffly, seething but unable to argue. The meeting ended with the board agreeing to review their enforcement policies, but I knew this wasn't over. Nancy wouldn't let it go. But neither would I. Nancy was furious. That much was obvious after the HOA meeting. Her usual air of smug authority had been replaced with quiet rage, her lips pressed into a thin line as she stormed out of the clubhouse without a word. The board had agreed to review their enforcement policies, but I wasn't naive enough to think she would back down completely. People like Nancy didn't accept public humiliation easily. The next morning, I was proven right. A formal letter arrived in my mailbox, this time on embossed HOA letterhead, its language filled with the kind of vague legal jargon meant to intimidate homeowners into compliance. According to Nancy's latest stunt, my garage was now an unapproved structure modification that required immediate rectification. This was different from the previous claim about aesthetic guidelines. Now she was trying to push a whole new angle, hoping I wouldn't notice. But I did. I sat at my dining table, reading the letter over as Warren fixed himself a cup of coffee. He glanced at me, noting the way my fingers drummed against the paper. "She doubled down, didn't she?" he asked. I handed him the letter. He read it quickly before letting out a low chuckle. "She's really reaching now. That's because she knows she lost the first round," I said. "She's trying to find a new way to force me into compliance." Warren set the letter down. "So what's the play?" I had already started forming a plan. If Nancy wanted to escalate, I would make sure it backfired spectacularly. First, I needed to verify exactly what she was trying to use against me. I pulled up the HOA's publicly filed documents and compared them to my original blueprints. Every home in this neighborhood had followed the exact same structural guidelines, meaning if my garage was an unapproved modification, then so were dozens of others. I noted down addresses homes identical to mine so I could use them as evidence when the time came. Then I paid a visit to City Hall. I had friends in the planning and zoning department, and after a quick conversation I obtained copies of the original permits for the entire neighborhood. These documents proved that my home, including the garage, had been built to code and approved by the city long before the HOA even existed. If Nancy wanted to claim my garage was a modification, she was going to have to explain why the city itself had signed off on it. That wasn't all. While reviewing the HOA's records, I found something interesting, something that could turn the entire situation against her. It appeared Nancy had personally approved an unauthorized expansion on her own house several years ago. I smiled to myself. This was going to be fun. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the weekend, and I made sure to arrive early. The room was already packed by the time I walked in, homeowners whispering amongst themselves. Word had spread about the previous meeting, and people were eager to see what would happen next. Nancy sat at the front, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in her posture. She knew I wasn't going to let this slide. When the meeting began, I waited patiently for the usual housekeeping matters to be addressed before raising my hand. The moment I was acknowledged, I stood and walked to the front, holding up the letter Nancy had sent me. "I'd like to address this new violation notice I received," I said, my voice carrying through the room. "The HOA is now claiming my garage is an unapproved structural modification. However, I've taken the liberty of reviewing city records, and I have copies of the original permits that prove my home was built exactly as intended with full city approval." I held up the documents for everyone to see. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Nancy stiffened in her seat. I continued, "Now, if the HOA is claiming my garage is a modification, that means they're contradicting city records. And if they're enforcing this rule, they'll need to apply it to every home with the same design, meaning a significant portion of the neighborhood is also in violation." Gasps erupted from the audience. Several homeowners looked at one another in concern. Nancy's face paled. She knew exactly what I was doing. Before she could interrupt, I turned the tables even further. "But that's not all," I said, flipping to another set of documents. I also reviewed HOA approval records and found an interesting discrepancy. It appears that some modifications have been personally approved without going through the proper channels. I walked over and placed a packet of documents in front of the board members. For example, Nancy Whitmore's home has an expansion that was never voted on by the community. Silence fell over the room. Nancy's hands clenched into fists. "That's absurd." "It's right here in the records," I interrupted smoothly. "An extension behind your property that was never subject to a community vote, despite the fact that you're now trying to enforce rules on others for far less." The tension in the room was palpable. Homeowners who had been fined or forced into compliance by Nancy's arbitrary rules were now looking at her with open suspicion. A man from the back of the room spoke up. "So, she gets to break the rules, but the rest of us have to follow them?" Another homeowner shook his head. I had to pay a fine for changing my mailbox, but she gets to expand her house? The murmurs turned to outright frustration. People were angry, and rightfully so. One of the other board members, Richard, cleared his throat. I think it's clear that we need to take a serious look at our enforcement practices. Moving forward, we should ensure all rules are applied fairly and that no one receives special treatment. Nancy looked like she wanted to argue, but the tide had turned against her. She was outnumbered. I leaned against the table, meeting her gaze with a calm, measured stare. So, Nancy, will you be rescinding my violation, or would you like to issue one for yourself as well? She didn't answer. She couldn't. The rest of the board conferred quietly before Richard turned to the audience. Effective immediately, the violation against Elaine is rescinded, and we will be reviewing past enforcement policies to ensure fairness in the future. A wave of satisfaction washed over me as the room broke into applause. Nancy sat stiffly, her face a mask of barely contained fury. She had lost. And worse for her, she had lost publicly. As I gathered my documents and turned to leave, Warren met me at the door, grinning. You really do know how to shut them down, don't you? I shrugged, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. People like Nancy think they can control everything. They forget that rules apply to them, too. The neighborhood had seen the truth, and Nancy's grip on power had been shattered. For the first time in a long time, it felt like real change was coming. Nancy's silence at the HOA meeting had been a small victory, but I knew her well enough to expect retaliation. People like her didn't accept public humiliation without plotting a way to regain control. She had built her authority on intimidation and selective enforcement, and now that foundation was crumbling beneath her. I had exposed her hypocrisy in front of the entire neighborhood, and the board had been forced to walk back their bogus violation against me. That alone had weakened her grip, but I wasn't naive enough to think she would let it go. The fallout from the meeting spread quickly. Over the next few days, I received messages from neighbors, many of whom had been quietly frustrated with the HOA's arbitrary rules but had been too afraid to speak up before. They thanked me for standing up to Nancy and the board, and more than one person mentioned that they were considering challenging their own past violations. Nancy, however, was nowhere to be seen. Normally, she was the type to patrol the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, scrutinizing lawns, measuring fences, and looking for any excuse to issue citations. But now she was conspicuously absent. It was unnerving. Warren and I kept an eye out, fully expecting some kind of petty retaliation. It didn't take long for her next move to become apparent. 3 days after the meeting, I received a letter from the HOA's legal counsel. This time, the language was much more aggressive. The letter claimed that my continued defiance of HOA regulations had resulted in a formal review of my property and that I was now being cited for multiple violations, ranging from landscaping infractions to improper waste bin storage. I stared at the letter, my jaw tightening. It was clear what was happening. Nancy couldn't win on the garage issue, so she was throwing anything she could at me, hoping something would stick. Warren read the letter over my shoulder, shaking his head. She's grasping at straws, he said. None of this was an issue before. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. She's trying to overwhelm me with nonsense violations, hoping I'll back down. He folded his arms. So what's the plan? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked over to my desk, pulled out my file of HOA records, and started flipping through them. I had been prepared for this. Nancy's pattern of selective enforcement wasn't just unethical, it was legally questionable. If she wanted to play dirty, I was going to hit back with something she couldn't ignore. The next day, I sent a formal request for documentation to the HOA board, demanding to see records of violation notices issued in the past 2 years. Under state law, homeowners had the right to request and review HOA enforcement records, and I was going to use that to my advantage. If Nancy had been selectively targeting homeowners she didn't like while ignoring violations from her allies, I would have the proof in black and white. Predictably, my request was ignored. That was a mistake. I followed up with a second request, this time citing the specific legal statute that required the HOA to provide the records. When that was ignored as well, I filed a formal complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Commission. Nancy must have realized she had overplayed her hand, because 2 days later, I received an email from another board member, Richard, requesting a private meeting to discuss my concerns. I agreed, but I wasn't going alone. When I arrived at the HOA office, I brought my attorney, Lisa, a no-nonsense property law expert who had dealt with corrupt HOAs before. Nancy was already inside, along with Richard and another board member, Susan. They clearly hadn't expected me to bring legal representation because the moment Lisa walked in, Nancy's expression hardened. Richard, however, looked nervous. He gestured for us to sit. "We wanted to clear up any misunderstandings," he said carefully. Lisa folded her hands on the table. "There's no misunderstanding. My client filed a lawful request for HOA enforcement records which she is entitled to review under state law. The HOA's failure to comply is a violation." Nancy spoke up, her voice clipped. "The board isn't required to provide those records." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Actually, you are. And if you continue to withhold them, we will escalate this to state authorities." A tense silence followed. Susan, who had been quiet until now, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Richard cleared his throat. "There's no need for legal action. We'll provide the records." Nancy shot him a sharp look, but he ignored her. He knew they had no legal ground to stand on. I nodded. "Good. And while we're at it, I'd like to formally challenge the bogus violations that were issued against me immediately after the last meeting." Richard glanced at Nancy, then back at me. "We can review them." Lisa smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll do more than review them. You'll rescind them. Otherwise, we'll be looking into legal action for harassment and selective enforcement." Nancy's fingers curled into fists, but she said nothing. Richard sighed. "Fine. The violations will be rescinded." Lisa leaned back in her chair. "And the records?" He hesitated, then nodded. "We'll provide them by the end of the week." I stood, gathering my papers. "I'll be looking forward to it." As I walked out, I caught Nancy glaring at me, her face taut with fury. She had lost again, and this time she knew she was running out of options. But I wasn't done yet. When the records arrived, I pored over them carefully, highlighting every instance of selective enforcement. As I suspected, Nancy had been targeting specific homeowners with violations while allowing her friends and allies to break the rules without consequence. This wasn't just an abuse of power. It was grounds for legal action. I compiled my findings into a detailed report and submitted it to the state HOA commission along with sworn statements from several neighbors who had been unfairly targeted. The fallout was swift. An official investigation was launched into the HOA's practices, and within weeks, Nancy was forced to step down as president. The board was restructured and new policies were put in place to ensure fair enforcement of regulations. For the first time in years, homeowners felt like they had a real voice in how their neighborhood was run. Nancy, on the other hand, disappeared from public view. Without her position of power, she had no influence left. As I stood on my porch, watching a group of neighbors chatting happily down the street, Warren joined me, sipping his coffee. "You did it," he said. "She's finally out." I smiled. She thought she could control everything. She forgot that people will always push back when they've had enough. He chuckled. "So, what's next?" I looked around at the neighborhood. I had designed the place I had once loved before Nancy and her power-hungry antics had tainted it. Now, it felt like it was finally being restored. "Now," I said, "we make sure it stays fair. Because if there was one thing I had learned, it was that people like Nancy would always try to claw their way back into power. And I would be ready." Nancy's fall from power should have been the end of it, but I knew better than to assume she would just fade into the background. People like her didn't accept defeat gracefully. They stewed in resentment, waiting for an opportunity to claw their way back. 3 weeks after her resignation, I found myself at a newly restructured HOA meeting. The room felt different this time, lighter, less oppressive. With Nancy gone, the board had been forced to adopt more transparent policies, and homeowners who had previously stayed silent now spoke freely. Richard, who had taken over as interim president, addressed the room with a measured tone, explaining the new processes for approving rule changes. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't acting as a dictatorship. As I listened, I noticed a familiar figure lurking at the back of the room. Nancy. She wasn't seated like the others. She stood near the exit, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't here to participate, she was here to observe. I turned my attention back to Richard, but I made a mental note. Whatever Nancy was planning, it wasn't over yet. The meeting adjourned without incident, and as I stepped outside, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to find Nancy standing there, her posture stiff. She didn't look defeated. She looked calculating. For a moment, I expected her to lash out, to hurl accusations or threats. Instead, she simply tilted her head slightly, studying me. I didn't give her the satisfaction of speaking first. Instead of engaging, I walked past her toward my car. But as I reached the door, her voice sliced through the air. You think you've won? I paused, turning just enough to meet her gaze. She lifted her chin slightly. But you don't understand how things actually work. I could have ignored her. I could have walked away. But something in her tone told me she wasn't just bitter, she had a plan. I leaned against my car, arms folded. Enlighten me. Her eyes glinted with something dangerous. HOA rules are one thing, but property values? Zoning ordinances? Those are much bigger battles. I knew exactly what she was implying. She might have lost control over the HOA, but she was hinting at something beyond that. Something she hadn't yet revealed. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. Developers, investors, they care about stability. If they think this neighborhood is losing control, they'll push for changes. And you won't be able to stop them. It clicked. She wasn't trying to regain control of the HOA, she was trying to go over its head. I kept my expression neutral. And what exactly do you think you can accomplish? She gave a slow nod toward the street. This neighborhood is valuable. If someone were to make the right proposal, the city might approve a rezoning. Maybe even allow for some new developments. Once that happens, the HOA won't matter anymore. Rezoning. She was trying to shift the battlefield. I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice even. And who exactly do you think would benefit from that? Her lips pressed into a thin line. People who understand how to adapt. I met her gaze, unblinking. You mean people like you? She didn't deny it. I pushed off my car. Good luck with that, I said, turning away. I had no doubt that Nancy would try something. But now that I knew her angle, I could prepare. And I wasn't about to let her tear apart the neighborhood I had built. Over the next week, I did my research. Rezoning wasn't an easy process, but it wasn't impossible either, especially if someone with influence pushed the right buttons. I reached out to a contact in the city's planning department, a former colleague from my architect days. When I explained my concerns, he agreed to look into any recent rezoning inquiries in the area. 2 days later, he called me back. There's been some preliminary chatter, he said. Nothing official yet, but an unnamed party has been making inquiries about potential zoning adjustments in your neighborhood. I didn't need to ask who that unnamed party was. Any idea what they're trying to do? I asked. Not entirely clear, but if I had to guess, they're looking into multifamily developments. That would change the entire character of your neighborhood. Nancy was trying to bring in outside investors, likely under the guise of modernizing the area. If she got her way, property values would shift, longtime homeowners could be forced out, and she could position herself as a key player in the transition. I thanked my contact and immediately started working on a plan. Nancy had always relied on secrecy, on doing things quietly until it was too late for anyone to stop her. But this time I was going to expose her before she had the chance to gain any momentum. That evening, I called Richard and explained the situation. He was understandably concerned, but he also knew that if we acted quickly, we could get ahead of it. We scheduled an emergency community meeting, this time inviting a city zoning official to speak. If Nancy was trying to manipulate the system, we were going to shine a light on it before she could get too far. The meeting was packed. Homeowners who had been relieved after Nancy's resignation now sat with tense expressions, realizing that the fight wasn't over. Richard opened the floor with a brief explanation, then introduced the city zoning official, a woman named Karen Martinez. Karen didn't waste time. She explained the rezoning process, how proposals were submitted, and what it would mean if the neighborhood's zoning classification changed. Then she dropped the bombshell. In the past 30 days, there have been multiple inquiries regarding potential zoning adjustments in this area, she said. While no formal applications have been filed yet, the level of interest suggests that someone is actively exploring the possibility. The room erupted with concerned murmurs. I stood, addressing the crowd. We all know who's behind this. All eyes turned toward the back of the room where Nancy stood, arms crossed. She didn't deny it. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice calm. This neighborhood is stagnant. Property values are plateauing. A rezoning could bring in new opportunities. Homeowners weren't buying it. A man near the front shook his head. You mean it could bring in developers who don't care about the people who live here? Nancy's gaze swept across the room. Change is inevitable. Either we control it or we get left behind. I met her eyes. You mean either you control it? She didn't answer. Richard turned to Karen. What can we do to stop this? Karen nodded. If enough homeowners formally oppose future rezoning efforts, it will make it significantly harder for any proposal to gain traction. That was all I needed to hear. I turned back to the crowd. Then let's make sure our voices are heard. The next day, we launched a petition gathering signatures from nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood. By the end of the week, we had submitted a formal opposition letter to the city, making it clear that any rezoning attempt would be met with fierce resistance. Nancy's plan crumbled before it even began. She had underestimated us. Again, as I watched neighbors rally together, I realized something important. Nancy had spent years trying to control this neighborhood through fear. But now people weren't afraid anymore. And that was something she would never be able to undo. Nancy was finished, or at least she should have been. After her failed attempt to rezone the neighborhood, she had no power left, no allies on the board, and no credibility among the homeowners. But people like her didn't just disappear. They lingered, waiting for the right moment to strike. I was determined to make sure that moment never came. With Nancy out of the HOA, the board had shifted towards transparency. Richard, now the official president, worked closely with the community to undo years of selective enforcement and arbitrary nonsense. The homeowners, once afraid to challenge the HOA, had become more engaged than ever. People were attending meetings, questioning rules, and demanding fair treatment. It was exactly the kind of neighborhood I had envisioned when I first designed it. But Nancy wasn't the type to accept irrelevance. A month after her last failed stunt, I noticed something strange. Richard called an emergency meeting, one that wasn't on the usual HOA schedule. That alone was odd, but when I arrived at the clubhouse, the tension in the air was unmistakable. Homeowners murmured amongst themselves, some looking confused, others wary. Richard stood at the front, flipping through a stack of documents, his expression grim. When the room settled, he cleared his throat. We have a situation. No one needed to ask who was behind it. He gestured to the papers in front of him. As you all know, the HOA has been working to correct past enforcement issues and ensure fair policies going forward. However, it has come to our attention that there are outstanding legal claims tied to the association. Claims that were filed before Nancy stepped down. A woman near the front frowned. What kind of claims? Richard sighed. Liens. The room erupted into shocked whispers. I narrowed my eyes. She filed liens against homeowners? Richard nodded. Nancy issued a series of liens against properties for unpaid violations that were never properly documented. Some of these liens were recorded right before she resigned, likely as an attempt to create financial leverage over homeowners even after losing her position. A man in the back shook his head in disbelief. You're telling me I have a lien on my house because she didn't like the color of my shutters? Richard looked pained. Unfortunately, yes. The sheer audacity of Nancy's final move was almost impressive. Almost. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. How many properties are affected? Richard hesitated before answering. 37. 37 homes in the neighborhood were now tied up in fraudulent liens thanks to Nancy's last-ditch effort to cling to power. I glanced around the room, seeing the growing fear on my neighbors' faces. A lien wasn't just an annoying fine, it was a legal claim against their property. It could affect mortgages, refinancing, even the ability to sell their homes. Nancy had made sure that even in defeat, she could still make life miserable for the people who had defied her. But she had made a critical mistake. I stood up, addressing the room. These liens were filed fraudulently. That means they can be challenged and removed. But we have to act fast. Richard nodded. I've already spoken with the HOA's legal counsel. They're reviewing the claims now, but it'll take time. In the meantime, if anyone here has received notice of a lien on their property, I urge you to bring your paperwork forward. Homeowners rushed forward, handing over documents, some shaking with anger, others with worry. As I skimmed through the paperwork, it became increasingly obvious that Nancy hadn't even tried to make the liens look legitimate. Many of them referenced violations that didn't exist, citing rules that had never been voted on. She had assumed no one would challenge her. She was wrong. I turned to Richard. We need to file a motion to remove these liens immediately. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be for homeowners to clean up this mess. He nodded. Already in progress. But I wasn't satisfied with just undoing the damage. I wanted Nancy to answer for what she had done. I spent the next 2 days working with a lawyer, Lisa, the same one who had helped me take on the HOA before. We filed complaints against Nancy for fraudulent filings, abuse of power, and financial misconduct. And then we took it a step further. With the help of some of the affected homeowners, we pushed for a civil suit against her. If she wanted to play legal games, we would make sure she paid for every single one of them. Nancy, of course, tried to fight back. She hired a lawyer of her own, claiming that the liens were valid under HOA regulations. But with the board no longer under her control, she had no authority to enforce those rules. And when the court reviewed the liens, it became clear that they were based on fabricated violations. One by one, the liens were removed. But the real blow came when the court ruled in favor of the homeowner's lawsuit. Nancy was ordered to pay damages for every fraudulent lien she had filed. Tens of thousands of dollars in legal penalties. The final nail in the coffin. By the time it was over, Nancy wasn't just powerless, she was financially ruined. She sold her house within weeks, disappearing from the neighborhood without so much as a word. And just like that, she was gone. With Nancy out of the picture, the neighborhood finally found peace. The HOA continued its path toward fairness, and homeowners no longer lived under the shadow of arbitrary rules and selective enforcement. One evening, as I stood in my driveway, Warren joined me, hands in his pockets. "It's finally over," he said. I nodded. "For now. Think someone else will try to pull another Nancy in a few years?" I exhaled, considering the possibility. "Maybe, but at least now people know they can fight back." He chuckled. "And they know exactly who to call if they need help." I smiled. Damn right. The neighborhood was stronger now, no longer afraid of those who sought to control it. And if anyone ever tried to pull another power grab, they'd learn the same lesson Nancy did. We weren't going to let it happen again.